let me just explain in 2 minutes the Ukraine war. This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day.
Welcome back to another episode of the KH podcast, where we dive deep into the stories shaping our world. In today's episode, we're unpacking a powerful conversation with Columbia University. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, he's making the case for Europe to step out from under U.S. influence and forge its own path, one rooted in diplomacy, trade, and cooperation with Russia. Sachs pulls no punches as he critiques America's unipolar foreign policy, calling out decades of reckless interventions and ineffective sanctions that have only fueled global tensions. Instead, he envisions a multipolar world where countries like China, India, and Russia play key roles, and where dialogue replaces confrontation. Can Europe rise to the challenge? And what would it take to shift from conflict to collaboration on the global stage? Let's find out together.
Welcome to our deep dive, into the work of economist Jeffrey Sachs. Today we're tackling some pretty big ideas about the changing global landscape.
Yeah.
You sent over a whole collection of articles and interviews with him, and wow, there's a lot to discuss.
Absolutely. Sachs has such a unique way of connecting economics and geopolitics. It really makes for a very compelling perspective.
Yeah, it's not just about, military strength anymore. He's talking about industrial capacity, trade relationships, even the psychology of international relations.
And what I think is so fascinating is how Sachs uses these historical parallels to illuminate current events. For instance, he argues that understanding the dynamics of the Crimean War can really help shed light on the current situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, so let's get into it. One of Sachs's most prominent arguments is that Europe needs to chart its own course, particularly when it comes to Russia. He contends that Europe's reliance on the U.S. has actually been detrimental.
Yeah, he makes a strong case. Europe, with its 450 million people and a $20 trillion economy, is undeniably a force to be reckoned with. Yet Sachs argues it's not wielding its influence effectively, especially when it comes to its relationship with Russia.
He uses pretty strong language, referring to the current climate between Europe and Russia as hate talk. Do you think that's an exaggeration?
I think it highlights the breakdown of communication and understanding more than anything. He's pointing to the fractured trade relationship, which is harmful to both sides. These economies are complementary. They actually need each other. Sachs specifically advocates for normalizing trade relations, emphasizing the mutual benefits this would bring.
Yeah, Sachs doesn't hold back when critiquing U.S. foreign policy either. He calls it reckless, even using the term delusional to describe America's belief in its global dominance. That's a pretty harsh assessment.
It is, but what's striking is how he supports these strong claims with historical analysis. He points out the U.S. has a history of intervening in other countries' elections and attempting to change regimes it doesn't like.
And according to Sachs, some U.S. strategists actually believed Russia wouldn't resist their actions in Ukraine. What makes him say that?
Well, he points to the push for NATO expansion as a prime example, arguing that this was a miscalculation, a major provocation to Russia. He even cites a RAND Corporation paper from 2019, which openly advocated for weakening Russia, aiming to limit its global influence.
So Sachs sees this type of thinking as outdated, ignoring the realities of a changing world. What evidence does he offer to support this?
He highlights the rise of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as evidence of this shift in global power. He sees this bloc, which represents a huge portion of the global economy and population, as a direct challenge to the traditional dominance of the G7. The recent BRICS summit in Kazan had 36 countries in attendance. It definitely suggests a move away from a U.S.-centric world order.
Let's talk about those sanctions. Everyone keeps talking about Sachs claims they haven't worked. It might have even made things worse.
Exactly. He argues that sanctions against Russia didn't achieve their intended goals and may have even contributed to the conflict. He sees them as a symptom of a larger problem, a reliance on confrontation rather than cooperation.
Instead, he advocates for finding areas of mutual economic benefit, particularly between Europe and Russia, instead of relying on these sanctions.
This is a key part of his argument. He's not just pointing out problems, but offering solutions. He believes that focusing on shared interests can help overcome these seemingly intractable conflicts, but it would require a major shift in mindset, moving away from zero-sum thinking towards a more collaborative approach.
He uses the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage as an example, which cut off a vital energy link between Russia and Germany. Sachs argues this act was driven by a desire to maintain U.S. dominance even at the expense of European interests. He even goes so far as to say that the U.S. was behind the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. That's a serious allegation.
It is, and while he doesn't explicitly state his sources, he does reference investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who published a detailed report alleging U.S. involvement. While this report has been contested by U.S. officials, it's certainly generated a lot of discussion and scrutiny.
It's certainly a controversial issue, but setting aside the Nord Stream incident, Sachs's point is clear. The U.S. needs to fundamentally change how it approaches its relationships with other countries, especially Russia.
He's adamant that the current approach based on containment and confrontation is unsustainable and ultimately counterproductive. He argues it creates mistrust and hostility, making it difficult to address shared challenges such as climate change and global economic instability.
So what does he propose instead?
Sachs is calling for a new era of diplomacy, one based on mutual respect and a willingness to find common ground. He maintains there's no inherent conflict between the U.S. and Russia, just misunderstandings and missed opportunities for dialogue. For example, he brings up the draft security agreement Putin put forward in December 2021 that the Biden administration didn't engage with.
It makes you wonder what could have been different. Do we know what was in that agreement? Could it have prevented the conflict?
That's a question worth exploring, and to further illustrate his point, he also advocates for a two-state solution in the Middle East as the key to peace in that region.
So while Sachs is deeply critical of current approaches, he does seem to offer a more optimistic outlook. It's not all doom and gloom.
Exactly. He believes peace between the U.S. and Russia is achievable. He sees fostering trade and investment between nations as a powerful tool for building trust and promoting stability.
And he's specifically emphasizing the need for Europe and Russia to rebuild their economic ties. He sees this as beneficial for everyone involved.
Right. It's not a zero-sum game. And it's important to remember that Sachs isn't just some armchair theorist. He's deeply involved in international development and has worked extensively with governments around the world. He's speaking from a place of experience and pragmatism.
Which brings us to another key idea, the multipolar world. He sees the rise of the BRICS nations not as a threat, but as a chance to create a more balanced and equitable global order.
Yes, he believes a multipolar world where power is more evenly distributed could actually be more stable and peaceful in the long run.
So is he saying the U.S. is no longer a superpower?
I wouldn't say he's arguing that, but he is challenging the idea that the U.S. should be the sole arbiter of global affairs.
He's suggesting that a world with multiple centers of power, where the U.S. is not the only one calling the shots, could be a good thing, leading to more cooperation and a fairer distribution of resources. It does make you think about power in a different way.
Absolutely. He sees the ability to cooperate and build consensus as equally important as military and economic might in this new global landscape.
It sounds idealistic, but is it realistic? Can countries with such different histories, values, and interests truly find ways to work together?
That is the million-dollar question, and Sachs acknowledges the challenges. Building trust and finding common ground will be difficult, requiring patience, compromise, and understanding different perspectives.
He stresses that there is no fundamental conflict between the U.S. and Russia. He believes the current tensions are primarily a result of misunderstandings and missed opportunities for dialogue. He believes we can choose hope over fear and cooperation over conflict, but it's a choice we had to actively make.
You know, Sachs doesn't just offer these broad critiques. He really dives into specifics when it comes to what he calls America's unipolar delusion.
Yeah, he does use some strong language there. What exactly is he getting at with that phrase?
Well, he's referring to a belief that he sees as pervasive in U.S. foreign policy circles, this idea that the U.S. is the sole superpower with the right to dictate the global order. It's this belief, he argues, that has led the U.S. into a series of costly and ultimately unsuccessful conflicts, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan.
So he's suggesting this unipolar mindset has actually been detrimental to U.S. interests.
Precisely. He argues it's rooted in a kind of historical amnesia, a failure to learn from past mistakes. And he sees the current conflict in Ukraine as a prime example of this misguided thinking. Well, he argues that by pushing for NATO expansion and meddling in Ukrainian politics, the U.S. essentially backed Russia into a corner, provoking a response. He even calls out specific figures like Victoria Nuland, a high-ranking U.S. diplomat involved in the events leading up to the 2014 Maidan revolution in Ukraine.
So he's suggesting she had a hand in pushing for regime change in Ukraine, even if it meant destabilizing the region and antagonizing Russia.
Yes, and he argues that this interventionist approach has become a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy, rarely leading to positive outcomes.
Sachs provides other examples of this.
He does. He points to the intervention in Libya in 2011, initially intended to protect civilians. He argues that the U.S.-led intervention ultimately threw the country into chaos and civil war.
So he sees a pattern of the U.S. acting on good intentions, perhaps, but without fully understanding the complex realities on the ground.
That's his argument. He sees it as a combination of hubris and naivete, this belief that the U.S. can impose its will on other countries without really grasping the intricacies of the situation.
And it's not just military interventions he criticizes. He's also skeptical of economic sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, right?
Absolutely. He argues they're often ineffective, sometimes even counterproductive. He believes sanctions frequently end up hurting ordinary citizens more than the intended targets and can actually strengthen the resolve of authoritarian regimes.
Does he have a specific example in mind?
He often cites Cuba. He points out that decades of U.S. sanctions have failed to topple the communist government and have instead inflicted immense suffering on the Cuban people.
So if Sachs is so critical of U.S. foreign policy as it stands, what does he propose as an alternative? What does he think a better approach would look like?
Well, he advocates for a more restrained and pragmatic approach, emphasizing diplomacy, cooperation, and respect for national sovereignty.
Essentially, a complete shift away from the unipolar delusion he described.
Exactly. He argues that the U.S. can no longer dictate global affairs unilaterally, but must learn to cooperate with other major powers, including China and Russia.
That sounds reasonable in theory, but what would that look like in practice? What concrete policy changes is he suggesting?
One of his key recommendations is for more dialogue and negotiation, even with countries considered adversaries. He believes open communication is essential for building trust and resolving disagreements peacefully. He highlights the Iran nuclear deal as an example, which he sees as a major diplomatic accomplishment, despite being undermined by the Trump administration.
So he's advocating for a more nuanced approach, one that recognizes the complexities of international relations and prioritizes finding common ground.
Yes. He argues that the U.S. needs to be more willing to compromise and to see things from other perspectives. He believes that this is the only way to build a more stable and peaceful world.
What does this look like in the context of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, he explicitly calls for a negotiated settlement that addresses Russia's security concerns while respecting Ukraine's sovereignty. He argues that a ceasefire and a political solution are the only way to end the violence and prevent a larger conflict.
And beyond Ukraine, are there other specific relationships he focuses on?
He emphasizes the need for greater economic cooperation between the U.S. and China. He argues that the two countries are too interconnected to risk a Cold War-style confrontation.
So instead of viewing China solely as a competitor or rival, he's advocating for more engagement and collaboration.
Exactly. He believes a more cooperative relationship based on mutual benefit and respect would be in the best interests of both countries and the world as a whole. He sees such cooperation as vital for tackling global issues like climate change, pandemics, and economic instability.
He's making a case for moving beyond traditional rivalries and recognizing the interconnectedness of the modern world.
Yes, he's arguing that these global challenges require collective action and a willingness to work together, transcending national borders and ideological differences.
So Sachs is proposing a fundamental change in the way the U.S. approaches foreign policy, a move away from confrontation and towards a more cooperative approach.
Yes, he's calling for a more humble and realistic assessment of U.S. power, a willingness to work with other countries to solve common problems, and a foreign policy grounded in diplomacy, dialogue, and respect for national sovereignty.
It's an idealistic vision, but is it truly achievable given the current state of global affairs?
Well, he recognizes the challenges, but he believes it's both idealistic and pragmatic. He's not naive about the complexities of international relations, but he remains optimistic that a more peaceful and cooperative world is possible if we're willing to work for it.
He seems to be challenging not just U.S. foreign policy, but a whole way of thinking about international relations.
Absolutely. He's calling for a shift away from the zero-sum mentality that's dominated for so long towards a more win-win approach. He believes this is the only way to build a more stable, prosperous, and just world for everyone.
It's a big ask, but a compelling vision. So if Sachs is calling for a major overhaul of U.S. foreign policy, how does he see the rest of the world fitting into this new global order?
That's where his concept of the multipolar world comes in, and it's a concept he finds particularly fascinating.
He's referring to the growing influence of countries like China, India, Brazil, and Russia, right? Those countries that are challenging the traditional Western-dominated power structures.
Exactly. He sees these countries as reshaping the global landscape, not just economically, but politically as well.
And he doesn't seem to view this as a negative development. In fact, he suggests it could be a positive one.
That's right. He argues that a multipolar world where power is more evenly distributed could actually be more stable and peaceful than the unipolar world we've experienced over the past few decades.
So he sees it as a more natural and balanced way for the world to function.
Yes, reflecting the true diversity and complexity of the global community. And he points to the BRICS group of nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as a prime example of this emerging multipolarity.
So he's impressed by their economic growth and their increasing influence on the global stage. He even suggests that the G7, the group of leading industrialized nations, might be becoming somewhat irrelevant in this new world order.
He does. He sees the BRICS as a potential counterbalance to the G7, offering a fresh perspective on global governance and providing a platform for developing nations to assert their interests. He also highlights the growing importance of regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union.
So he sees a shift happening not just in terms of individual countries gaining power, but also in the alliances and blocs that are forming.
Exactly. He sees these organizations as playing an increasingly crucial role in regional security and economic integration.
Okay, so if we accept Sachs's premise that we're moving towards a multipolar world, what are the implications? What does this mean for the future?
Well, he believes it will require a significant adjustment from the U.S., which has been accustomed to dictating terms for so long. He argues that the U.S. will need to learn to share power and work with other countries on a more equal footing.
A pretty big shift for a country that's been used to being the dominant global force.
It is, but he sees this not just as a challenge, but as an opportunity. He believes a multipolar world could lead to greater cooperation and a more equitable distribution of resources.
And potentially a more peaceful world as well.
That's his argument. He envisions a world where countries work together to address shared challenges like climate change, pandemics, and global poverty.
He paints a picture of a multipolar world as a more democratic and just world where all countries have a say and a role to play. It's a hopeful vision.
It is, but one that will require a fundamental change in thinking, both in the U.S. and globally.
A change in how we view power, how we approach cooperation, and how we understand our role in shaping the future.
And that's ultimately what Sachs is calling for, a willingness to embrace change, adapt to new realities, and work together to build a better future for all.
A pretty tall order, but perhaps necessary one. So we've talked a lot about his views on U.S. foreign policy and this idea of a multipolar world. But what about his specific thoughts on the conflict between the U.S. and Russia? He seems to have some strong opinions on that front.
He does. He's deeply concerned about the current tensions between the two countries, and he's very vocal about the need for peace. He argues that there's no inherent reason for conflict between the U.S. and Russia.
So what does he see as the root of the problem?
Well, he sees the current tensions as primarily stemming from misunderstandings and miscalculations and a lack of communication. You know, he even suggests that some U.S. strategists deliberately provoked Russia, believing they could weaken it or even bring about regime change.
That's a serious accusation. What evidence does he offer to support that claim?
He cites the Rand Corporation paper from 2019 as evidence of this kind of thinking. He finds it troubling that such a respected think tank would advocate for such a confrontational approach.
He seems to believe it's a dangerous game to play, especially given the fact that both countries possess nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And while he recognizes the differences between the U.S. and Russia, he also believes they have more in common than they realize. He points out that they both face similar challenges like terrorism, climate change, and economic instability.
So he's suggesting these shared challenges should be a basis for cooperation, not conflict.
Exactly. He believes that by working together, they could achieve far more than they could by trying to undermine each other. He even goes so far as to suggest that the U.S. could learn a thing or two from Russia. He admires their resilience in the face of sanctions and their willingness to stand up for their interests.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
He seems to have the more nuanced view of Russia than we often hear in mainstream discussions.
He does. He admires their cultural heritage and contributions to science and technology. I mean, he doesn't romanticize Russia, but he also doesn't demonize it. He sees it as a complex and multifaceted country that deserves to be treated with respect, not fear or disdain.
It's clear he has a deep understanding of Russia, its history, and its people.
Mm-hmm.
So if Sachs had the opportunity to speak directly to world leaders, what would he say to them? What advice would he give?
Well, I think he would implore them to put aside their differences and work together to build a more peaceful and just world. He would emphasize the importance of dialogue, diplomacy, and compromise. He would urge them to reject the zero-sum mentality that's dominated international relations for far too long, and instead embrace a more win-win approach to global problem solving.
So he sees cooperation and collaboration as the keys to a more stable and prosperous future.
He does. Yeah, he'd remind them that we're all interconnected, that our fates are intertwined, and that we have a shared responsibility to create a better future for everyone. He'd urge them to choose hope over fear, cooperation over conflict, and peace over war. And he wouldn't just stop at grand pronouncements. He'd push for concrete steps to be taken day by day to build a more just and sustainable world.
A powerful message, and certainly food for thought.
Hmm.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the negativity and conflict we see in the news. But it's important to remember that there are alternative paths, that peace and cooperation are achievable goals if we're willing to work for them. Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the ideas of Jeffrey Sachs. He really gave us a lot to think about.
He did.
Sachs certainly presents a challenging but ultimately hopeful perspective.
Yeah, I think what's so compelling is that he encourages us to think differently about power dynamics, international relations, and our own roles in shaping a more peaceful and cooperative future.
He doesn't shy away from critiquing the status quo, but he also offers a path forward, a way to navigate the complexities of our interconnected world.
Right, and whether or not you agree with all of his conclusions, his insights are sure to spark important conversations and encourage a deeper understanding of the global landscape.
We hope this deep dive has provided you with some new perspectives to consider, and perhaps even inspired you to explore these topics further. Thanks for joining us.